Welcome, everybody, to this slightly short notice office hour in which I want to discuss the unfolding fire weather event in parts of California. Operative word being in parts of California. I'll get into that in a moment. Just a reminder that these conversations and this channel is sponsored by Reask, a climate tech company that is rethinking Earth system risk and extreme weather, helping companies quantify all of the relevant data. So the reason why I popped in today, even though I've had some other sessions scheduled, and by the way, you should, if you're interested in this channel, you should check them out. There's a couple of special events coming up scheduled farther in advance than I usually do. You can check that out on the channel's main page. Is that there is a significant wind event that is unfolding or is about to unfold. It doesn't look super windy as of yet, as the gusts are just starting to increase in some parts of Central California, really from the San Francisco Bay Area, western Sacramento Valley, southward into parts of Southern California. And this is a pretty classic autumn wind event in that it is starting out as a north wind event, so not fully offshore, but veering more northeastward, so more of an offshore land-to-sea component as the event goes on. So right now, there's a bunch of places that are relatively cool, breezy to windy with reasonably high humidity, even some clouds around. And then, overnight tonight into tomorrow, those winds are going to shift toward a more northeasterly direction, and relative humidity will plummet into the 5 to 15% range. So dramatically drier air will be another piece of this upcoming fire weather event. The atmospheric blow dryer, I believe, is a term coined by somebody in the Weather West comment section. I think that's pretty apt in the sense that it is dry and windy, and in this case not particularly warm, but dry and windy. I think gets you most of the way there in terms of the fire weather threat. In fact, both humidity and winds are more important on a short-term basis than is temperature, although where temperature becomes very important is in the long run with respect to the amount of moisture that's in the vegetation to begin with. So vegetation, moisture, fuel aridity. And this summer and the past few weeks posed sort of an interesting question on that front in terms of fire risk, because there is actually a bit of a mixed bag when it comes to fuel conditions in terms of how dry the vegetation actually is. And I think that's worth delving into a little bit, because there's been some online discussion surrounding just how high the fire risk is in an event like this. And I think the first thing to realize is that California is, of course, a big geographically and climatologically diverse, ecologically diverse as well, state. And the reason why that matters here is that there are some places in California that are not going to see an extreme or even an elevated fire weather threat from this event. And that includes places in far northern California that saw a quarter to a half inch of rain yesterday. So those places clearly not going to be at the kind of risk for fast spreading dangerous wildfires that other parts of the state probably will be over the next couple of days. So if it has rained a quarter or a half inch at your place in the last couple of days, none of this really applies to you, fortunately. No matter how windy and how low the atmospheric humidity gets, you will be benefiting from that residual moisture that we've seen recently. And then there are some places that are a little bit borderline, places that saw a tenth or two of an inch of rain over the past week or so, that are not extremely dry, but are also not particularly moist, and then this event is going to come and dry things out further. So there may be some elevated fire threat in those spots, but not particularly extreme. They're either mitigated by those moderate fuel moistures that will fall from high moderate to low moderate, but not get into super dry territory. But there are some other parts of California right now where the vegetation is indeed quite dry. I don't think it's record dry anywhere, to be clear, and that is different than some recent extreme fire weather events in the late 2010s and early 2020s, where we did genuinely have vegetation that was, as far as we can quantify it, drier than it had ever been at that time of year in September or October, respectively. I don't think that's the case anywhere in California right now. So that is a partial mitigating factor in terms of the risk. But there are places where vegetation is still significantly drier than it would be on average for mid-October. I'm looking at the calendar and it's October 17th. So we are at a time of year when vegetation is often still pretty dry, not quite at peak summer-like dryness in many inland areas, but still far drier than it would be in the winter or the spring, and more than dry enough to be highly flammable under favorable fire weather conditions, as we're experiencing in certain places in California right now, with the strong winds and the low humidity inbound. And so the challenge here is a bit of a communication one, in that some folks in California will see essentially no meaningful fire risk this week, and other folks will probably see the most severe fire weather threat of the entire year so far, and perhaps even over the past couple of years, because last year did not bring very many elevated fire weather events to places like the San Francisco Bay Area and the Central Coast, because it was so damp and cool for the past couple of consecutive winters. So this will be a significant fire weather threat for much of the San Francisco Bay Area, parts of maybe southern Mendocino, southern Lake County, and the western fringe of the Central Valley as well. Much less so to the north, because it's been wetter and it also won't be as windy up there. And then to a certain extent in along the Central Coast and parts of the transverse ranges of coastal Southern California as well, where vegetation is still pretty close to peak seasonal dryness and where record high temperatures in recent weeks. The effect of that has been mitigated a little bit by higher humidity in recent days, but there has not been any rain down there in the Central Coast and in most of Southern California over the past week or so. And so the legacy of that record-breaking heat earlier in October is still present. Even though the vegetation is not at record dry levels, it is still drier than it would usually be down there at this time of year. So this is an event that is primarily a risk for the San Francisco Bay Area and sort of adjacent regions, including the Monterey Bay Area, parts of the Central Coast. The western side of the Sacramento Valley is very dry and will be very windy as well. So in the grasslands and in the transitional ecosystems, so the woodlands on the fringes of the Central Valley, also some issues there. There is technically a fire weather or a red flag warning also in effect for the lower foothills of the Sierra Nevada. I do not think the risk there is generally as high, although it certainly is elevated, and it is higher the further south you go along the foothills, because that's where things have been dry recently. The northern Sierra foothills, it rained immeasurably this week, so the risk will be lower, if not, though probably not zero. So it's all relative. And obviously, the very worst possible conditions are hot, dry, and windy. Well, it's not going to be hot this week. It is going to be very dry and very windy, but that's just the meteorological component, and there is an ecological vegetation component to this that's really important too. First, of course, is what is the vegetation that you have? Do you live in a grassland or a more transitional biome, like an oak woodland or something like that? Do you live in a heavy dense scrub vegetation region, so in the chaparral or in the camise? Do you live in a more forested area? Do you live in the trees, in the coniferous forest in the mountains, or in one of the denser oak forests, or in the coast redwoods? These are all very different ecological settings that have very different fire regimes. And so the first things that are going to dry out during a major atmospheric blow dryer event like this one are those grassland ecosystems. That is pretty clear. But things are already still dry enough at this time of year in other systems that also the transitional ecosystems could become extremely dry during an event like this as well. So while we don't have record-breaking vegetation dryness, we do have elevated, even relative to where we would normally be in October, which is still pretty dry, vegetation dryness in the Bay Area, along the Central Coast, and in some parts of Southern California, and that's where the risks will be high over the next couple of days. There are some folks who have pointed out that today the humidity has not dropped yet, although the winds have increased. So it is getting windy out there, but it's not super dry. That is entirely consistent with the forecast that the winds would pick up from the north today, but remain somewhat moist winds, and will become progressively stronger and drier as the air mass also warms. So this won't be a chilly wind event, which can sometimes happen. This will just be a mild wind. So the temperature will be in the 60s and 70s. That's relatively warm still for an October wind event in Northern California in particular. And more importantly, those winds will pick up as air dries out tomorrow with very low humidity, sucking a lot of that moisture back out of the landscape that was added through the higher humidity and rainfall in some spots in recent days. So the peak of this will likely be from tomorrow into Saturday, and winds, even in the lower elevations, will be gusty 30 to 40 miles an hour. That might not sound like much, but that's all the way down to sea level, so there will be significant winds just about everywhere in places like the Bay Area and along the Central Coast. Could even be some compressional warming in places like Santa Cruz that'll get a bit toastier than the rest of the Bay Area because of that air warming and descending as it flows down the west side of the Santa Cruz Mountains. But with much higher gusts possible over the higher elevations. So it is quite possible that places, the usual windy spots on the tops of the hills, will see 60, 70 mile an hour gusts. So of course the vast majority of people in California will not experience 60 or 70 mile an hour gusts because these are in somewhat remote hilltops. But if there's a fire up there, that is the kind of winds that they're going to experience, and so that's part of the reason why there's concern. But it also will be breezy to windy even at low elevations, and winds of 30 to 40 miles an hour are still enough to drive a very fast-moving fire at lower elevations as well. So that is the concern. And this gets into the question of relative risk. Is this the highest fire risk event I've ever seen? No, not by any means. Is it the highest of the last 5 years, even in these places? No, I don't think it is. So context is important there. But we still need to be able to talk about different levels of risk, because most of this summer, for example, the risk of wildfires, especially fast-spreading ones in places like the Bay Area, has actually not been that high. There have been grass fires, there have been brush fires, that's certainly true. But generally speaking, we haven't seen the confluence of extremely dry vegetation and very high winds this year or last year. We've seen high winds and very high temperatures and dry vegetation, even record dry vegetation earlier this summer, but these two things did not overlap. And so those very high-end risk days have not occurred. So even though the vegetation right now is not at its driest level that it's been this year even, nor are winds the strongest they will have been in the past few years, there are probably some places where the overlap of anomalously dry vegetation and anomalously strong dry winds probably will be about as high as it's been in a couple of years. So that is the kind of risk we're talking about. If anyone is familiar with the notion of recurrence intervals, how long you'd have to wait before an event of a similar intensity, it's nothing extraordinary, but it's probably a 1 to 3 year type recurrence interval. So an event that we might expect to see every other year or so in terms of fire risk in the contemporary era in the Bay Area along the Central Coast. So greatly elevated relative to ordinary conditions, even relative to ordinary autumn conditions, but nothing historic. Now, the other piece here is, what does that mean in context of risk? Well, if we get lucky, there will be no major fires, and this will be a total non-event, and I won't have to have another short notice live session. That would be great. But if you get unlucky, these are the kinds of conditions that are elevated enough that if you have an ignition in a bad place at the wrong time, you can get a wildfire disaster. And that's the thing about wildfire disasters, is that there is a major stochastic or random component to them. You can have the very worst fire weather conditions you've ever experienced on Earth, but if there's no ignition, there's no wildfire disaster. Or if there is an ignition under those conditions, but it's in a very remote area, away from where people live, you might also escape a disaster. So, of course, a disaster is contextual, is what I'm getting at there. And with wildfires, it's particularly sometimes finicky or random, in the sense that we don't know exactly where ignitions are going to be, if there are going to be ignitions. The reality is we live in a world where modern life involves fire. Fire is a part of modern life. We often don't think about it as such, but every combustion engine on the planet has a controlled fire burning inside of it. When we use electricity, usually there's not fire, but often there are sparks. Even just good old metal on metal machinery can generate sparks. So point being, there's lots of ways to, even if everybody's trying their best not to start a fire, there are ways for fires to start accidentally. And so there's always ignitions out there. You know, PG&E and other utilities in California are either considering or have already started to shut off power in some areas, so there are going to be public safety power shutoffs during this event. Not nearly as widespread as they were during the pretty terrible couple initial years of that implemented policy, where they would turn off the power to hundreds of thousands of people at a time for days on end. Now it's down into the tens of thousands and maybe even just in the thousands of customers, although multiply by 2 or 3 to get the number of people affected based on the number of customers, since usually there's more than one person per household. But anyway, it's an order of magnitude, or maybe 2 orders of magnitude, fewer people affected during these current episodes with better advanced warning. Nonetheless, it still is probably pretty disruptive if you're in those tens of thousands of people who may have their power turned off preemptively this week to avoid wildfire ignitions from power lines. So that is something that's likely to happen this week, although not on as widespread a scale as has previously been the case. And also, some places in far northern California that were originally on a public safety power shutoff watch list this week were removed. PG&E is no longer going to turn the power off in those places because, and I think this is probably appropriate, the rain this week made vegetation conditions sufficiently damp that the risk is not particularly severe in those locations. But they are continuing those outages in other places, and I think that too may be as an imperfect solution to a major problem, probably appropriate too, given the circumstances, because it is much drier and the risks are much higher in other places farther to the south. So I think that's the way to think about this right now. In terms of wind, so I do have some imagery I'll probably show. You may notice that today I'm not in my usual home office setup, but I am in fact in my physical office at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. So not an especially glamorous backdrop, but the internet connectivity is good, so that's always a plus. Hopefully folks are hearing me pretty clearly. Don't have my professional microphone set up here, but I think under the circumstances it'll work well. So bear with me for a moment while I transition over to sharing my screen. And what you should see in a moment will be some satellite imagery. All right, I just need to double check that works since I'm on a slightly different monitor setup than usual here. Yes, okay, that's working. All right, so what we see on screen here, and I'll get my drawing tool. That's the wrong tool here. What do I want? This is what I want. Okay, so you can see right now that there is now effectively northerly flow. So of course, when I say northerly, it's the direction from which the wind is coming. That is how wind directions are named, not the direction it's blowing to, which is a common misconception. But in any case, it's pretty easy to see from the motion of the clouds that the wind over northern and central California right now is from north to south. And it turns out that's true both at the surface and aloft. Not always the same, but in this case it is. There are some additional showers, so there's some instability over the mountains. So there are some brief showers up here again. Maybe I'll draw the region that saw significant rainfall recently. I'm not super concerned about the fire risk in about this part of the state. It may be windy up there, it may be dry, but there's been enough precipitation recently that, the fire risk will be probably not negligible, but also not super high. So that's the good news if you live up there. The much higher risk is pretty much going to be this region and cutting off some into Southern California, where it also extends. But this is just rough, but it suggests that most of the Central Valley and its foothills, generally speaking, along with the San Francisco Bay Area, maybe the Lake County, Monterey Bay areas, as well as the Central Coast and parts of Southern California, just based on the moisture that's fallen recently. I am guessing, and here's another little interesting feature, if you notice at the end of this satellite loop, there's kind of this arc going down. I am betting that this is almost a dry line-like feature. Not a real cold front, but I'm not sure there was a big temperature change, but I'm betting if you're in Winters or Davis, say, that you're experiencing a pretty robust north wind, and that humidity in the last hour or so finally started to plummet. So it was relatively high when these cumulus, stratocumulus clouds were still overhead, but that's a pretty clear indication. You can see this dry slot. Air is very clear behind that last line of clouds, and I think this is the start of the dry air mass right now coming south. That'd be my guess. Some rain over the Great Basin, so some decent rain totals in Nevada for October. We've seen that. And then let's see what happens if I zoom out here. To the regional view of the western U.S. So it's a pretty active pattern. It's been more wildfire than rain recently, but actually it's nice to see some rain falling, maybe even some high mountain snow in some places where there's been major wildfire activity recently. So what is the pattern that we're seeing right now? And let me zoom a little bit here. Again, this is the Tropical Tidbits site run by Levi Cohen. And as you can see, as we advance through this is a map of the western U.S. Again, this is the trophiness or the ridginess of the 500 millibar geopotential height anomaly. It's essentially the anomalousness of the middle atmospheric pressure patterns. You can see this is a classic inside slider. So what is an inside slider? I'm toggling back and forth in time. I'm going to get my drawing tool back out. No, it doesn't like me do the drawing tool when I have the animation going. Well, you get the idea. Follow the cursor here. This blue blob, this is the low pressure system that's currently, as of this is about right now, moving through the Great Basin, central western Nevada. So as you can see, this is an inside slider because it has slid inside of the coast. If this blue blob went right down the California coast, it might be an outside slider. So this is a bit of a baseball analogy, but the idea behind an inside slider is that it doesn't bring a whole lot of water to California, but can bring cooler air mass to the Great Basin and set up a pressure gradient in its wake. So it's actually not the low pressure system itself that causes the wind so much. So we have the low pressure here now. It's not extremely windy, but it's actually once it starts to depart and when the high pressure builds in behind it that we start to see these winds. So what I'll show you now are the dynamics. This is some atmospheric science 101. Let me just see which values I want. Yes, okay. So here you can see this is another view of it. This is at 700 millibars rather than at 500 millibars, so it's lower in the atmosphere. You can see this trough. It's a little bit harder to see it coming through Nevada, but look at what happens as we go into tomorrow in this vicinity near Lake Tahoe. So you can see that, again, wind barbs blow the direction from which the wind is blowing to where it's blowing. So you can see right now they're from north to south, fairly strong, but not extremely so. But then they start to shift offshore. They become northeasterly and then re-strengthen. And this is tomorrow into early Saturday. So you can kind of see, again, I'm going to go back in time. You can see the winds are onshore westerly and they suddenly shift to northerly late tonight into tomorrow. This is the fire weather threat, partly because, once again, if we look at the, let's see, I guess what we want here would be the, we don't have this in this model, so I have to go to the American model here. This is a data availability challenge. Yes, so what I really want to show is the 2 meter dew point. So again, dew point, the units are degrees Fahrenheit, but the lower the value, the drier the air. Well, this is what it's like right now. There's some somewhat dry air, but then it gets extremely dry. So we get dew points around 0 degrees Fahrenheit. That's very, very dry air, and that sticks around into the weekend. So again, these are not temperatures. These are dew point temperatures, which is actually a measure of humidity. And we start to see this. We go from having quite moist air over California, going back in time a day, this is the yesterday, suddenly very dry air. And so that is one of the big fire weather concerns. And that dry air sticks around really through the weekend. So although the winds die down later in the weekend, the dry air persists for a while. One other thing I wanted to show, these are some charts of the state of the vegetation dryness levels. So this particular variable is known as the energy release component, which is essentially an aggregate measure of vegetation flammability, incorporating several different factors. And these are for different regions. So along the north coast, in this case, the higher the value, the more flammable things are. The red value is the previous historical maximum observed value prior to this year. So what you can see is along the north coast, there have been episodes this year where we've actually seen the driest vegetation on record. This is back during the extreme July heat wave up here. And then again more recently in early October. You can see where we are right now, though, is right down around average along the north coast, although with this drying event we'll get back above average. But it's not nearly as flammable as it was, so this is the north coast perspective. Similar story, mid-coast and Mendocino. We've seen multiple periods, in fact a lot of the year, where vegetation was near record-breaking flammability, but it is not currently, although it is going to get drier and more flammable with this event. So similar pictures in different places. This is in the Bay Area where we see a pretty large rise with this upcoming event. And we see that this is not record-breaking vegetation dryness, but we're trending back towards drier than average. But there are other metrics as well that are relevant, and there's another metric known as the burning index, which is another composite metric that takes into account how fast a fire can spread and also how intense the fire could be. And here again, we see that earlier in the summer we saw some record values, but right now we're definitely not at record values along the north coast. But once we get closer to the Bay Area, we have actually seen, we may get pretty close to October record-breaking values during this event. So again, it's neither record-breaking dryness nor record-breaking extreme fire weather individually, but together, this green line spikes up into around the record maximum values for October. So that's a significant for the Bay Area during this event. And look at what happens in the Santa Cruz Mountains and the Diablo Range. There's a brief spike well into October record territory of this value. So it is to say that by some metrics, this could be a pretty notable fire weather event for certain parts of California, particularly the San Francisco Bay Area, and then also briefly up in the Central Valley and its foothills too. Less so in the Sierra, which is what you'd expect because there's been a lot moisture up there. So, and similar story in Southern California, where vegetation moistures are not particularly extremely dry right now, but we go to some of the mountains and look at some of the trends. Well, this is probably not the best way to look at this. So anyway, suffice it to say that in Southern California, some similar patterns are at play. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. You're going to see me again. All right, so my hope is that this session will actually be a little bit shorter in length than some other sessions, since I'm doing a whole lot of them. But I do want to take some time to answer questions now and perhaps end a little bit before the hour. It's possible that if some big bad fires get going, keep my fingers crossed that they won't, but if they do, I may join again tomorrow. But right now, fingers crossed, that won't be necessary, so I'll answer some questions that people have at the moment. Winds here in San Bruno Gap, says Mighty Mia, near SFO, are already increasing. Not surprising. That's a windy spot, particularly in a north wind pattern. That's sort of the topography lets those north winds through pretty well. Comment about the fuel stick. So I'm assuming this is somebody either in municipal or wildland firefighting. Go up from 24 at 9:15 a.m. presumably today to 5 at 3:15. This is in Santa Rosa Fire Department. Okay, so that's just an indication that this atmospheric blow dryer is already underway, and it will get more blow dryery in the hours to come. Very odd noise behind me. Sorry about that. I'll have to investigate that later. There is a comment that there could be a bit of rain in parts of Southern California. That is, it does occasionally occur during these inside slider events. It won't be much rain. It'll be more on the drizzle to light shower range, and it'll be quite patchy. A lot of places won't get any. But could happen, could mitigate some of the risk down there. I don't see this as being a widespread severe fire weather event for most of Southern California, mainly more on the central coast side of things, but maybe locally elsewhere. So that could help. There's a comment that this is setting up just like it did during the beginning of our last drought, with no to very little rainfall until December, which is hard to catch up. I would wait and see, but there is the reality that until there is widespread significant rainfall, which has not yet occurred and is not currently in the forecast for the next week or so in much of California, fire season will continue anytime there's a hot, dry, and or windy event, as we're experiencing now. This may yet not be the last event of the season still. In fact, I would lean toward it not being the last event of the season. Thanks for the comments about the drawing tool. So, the drawing tool, I think that's just the configuration currently with the multi-screen arrangement I have in my office. I need to figure that out later. As for the volume, I think that is probably a user interface challenge. Your mileage may vary with your home device, but I think my volume is about as appropriate as it should be on my end. Could be wrong, but that's my guess. Some comments that the winds are already veering to the northeast. That's exactly as forecast. A comment about tropical weather and the potential formation or non-formation of tropical systems in the Atlantic. Probably not the focus of today's conversation, but I know there's a lot of attention focused on it given the catastrophic after effects of Hurricane Helene in parts of the southeastern U.S. as well as Hurricane Milton. So probably for the best. There's nothing in the southeastern U.S. right now. There's also no organized tropical activity yet in the Caribbean or in Central America. That could still change, though. The water there is still very, very warm. Marine heat wave in the Caribbean, so stay tuned. All right, folks, so I think that's about, I think I've covered what I wanted to cover for the day. Again, today's is a bit of an abbreviated session, but I would also encourage folks to sign up to be notified for the upcoming events. Next week, next Friday, I believe it's the 25th in the morning, I'll be talking during a special event that I'm hosting with the director of a new climate change documentary on Earth tipping points. It's a documentary that I've been personally involved with. I'm featured in it, but also acted as a scientific advisor to it, and I think it's got some interesting perspectives on things that I don't talk about as much in these sessions, ordinarily at least, on what are the sort of the large scale dynamics at play when we talk about the ways in which things can go wrong in the Earth system in a warming climate. So thinking beyond extreme events like individual storms and heat waves and wildfire events and droughts, but thinking about the big interconnected Earth system players like the ocean current systems, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or the AMOC, so popularized in the movie The Day After Tomorrow, or the Amazon rainforest, or the potential sudden release of carbon from the biosphere in the Arctic. We talk about these things in the context of thinking about the interconnectedness of all these Earth systems, and also uncertainty and concern about where we might be headed in the broader paleoclimatological context of this. Where does this all fit into the Earth history perspective over thousands and even millions of years? So right now, this event is already scheduled. If you go over to my channel, which if you're watching this, there's a button you can click just to click on my icon. And I'll embed the link to this at the end of this conversation. But this event is already scheduled. So if you go to my live events, this is the one that's scheduled for the 25th. You can click on it. You can subscribe now, or you can just add it to your own calendar and remember to come over and check it out. This is another good reason to subscribe to the channel, because then you're automatically notified in most cases that I'm going to have these live sessions, and in particular you get some advance notice. Finally, I have another live session that's also scheduled already, and this is going to be for the Monday following, so at the very end of October, calling it an election special. It's a little bit tongue-in-cheek because I'm not really talking about the election, but I do want to talk about one specific aspect of something that is potentially at risk during this election, and it is a bit different than what many others have focused on. I really want to talk about the National Weather Service as effectively a public good in this country, and how the U.S. National Weather Service is unlike the publicly funded, taxpayer-funded weather services, meteorological services of any other nation on Earth. And it is, by the way, the envy of every other nation on Earth. And I think this is pretty clear. In fact, in preparing for the session, I've spoken with lots of meteorologists in different countries who have experience either with dealing with their own national meteorological services or, in particular, experience of what has happened when those countries have decided to privatize what was once a public good and the sort of disastrous aftermath of almost universally of those decisions. So I want to talk about that. And it's a little bit out of left field, I think, but I think it's an important conversation to have before November. So stay tuned for both of those live sessions, which will both be a bit different than usual. And during the live session on the 25th, the morning of the 25th, I will be joined by the director of this film, so we will be having a live conversation. So it won't just be me, but it'll be us in conversation, also taking questions live from the audience. So please do check that out. In fact, what I will do for you right now, because folks are saying they're having a hard time finding this, is I am currently going over and going to give you the link and put it in the chat right now, because it's something I'm able to share with you directly. So here you go. Here is the link. Should be there. There it is now. To the event on the 25th. So you can click on that directly and that will bring you there. Here is the link to all of my historically recorded and future forthcoming live streams. That'll be the next link here. And there you can find not only the scheduled coming live streams like the ones I just mentioned, but also links to all of the other ones that are out there, and including recorded ones. That's a link you can use to figure out, if you don't want to subscribe, even though I would recommend it, what's coming down the pike. So with that, I think I'm just about done for the day. Thanks everyone for listening. Stay safe out there. Don't emit any sparks when it's dry and windy. That's generally safe advice. We need more beneficial and prescribed fire, but generally speaking, we don't want them on days like we're going to have the next 2 days in the Bay Area and surrounding regions. So, but I'll see folks at a minimum next week, next Friday, on the 25th, and potentially, again, I hope not, because it probably means that something has blown up that we don't want to see. But if that happens tomorrow, I'll probably have a quick live stream to talk about it. All right, everybody, thanks again, and talk to you next time.